Hey y'all, it's Ryan. Temperatures are warming up around here, and for us, that means sun, sand, and waves. So today we're going to dive into the ocean and draw this cute little seahorse. So grab your drawing tools and let's get to it. To start our seahorse sketch, I know that I want him in the middle of my canvas because I know I'm gonna put coral and rocks somewhere over here and then draw a funky freehand outline around him. So I'm going to start by making sure my brush is set to dry ink and the ink is black. And then in my layers, click the plus sign to add a new layer. And then I'm going to start where his head meets his cute little nose. I'm going to draw kind of a half circle and then hold so it snaps for me. Okay, and then his little nose, I'm going to curve up to a point and then come down and around, and then the same curve but going back in. Okay. There we go. So now I'm going to add his jaw in, just to give it that separation between where his head is and the rest of his body, and his belly is going to show up. So again, just draw an arch and then hold it so it snaps too. Now, for me, it's easier to draw the front of the seahorse so that I can follow the same curve on the back. So for his belly, it is a really fun kind of S shape. And then where I have his, where the back of his head is right here, just follow that S shape around and join down here at the bottom to create his little tail. Okay, so then his little flipper, his fin, it is a rounded, almost like a rectangle, but not completely closed. So I'm gonna draw it in the center of his body here. I'm gonna draw a diagonal line down and then round it and then bring it back up. So I also want to make sure I give myself space for his belly. So where his body is up here, not where his head meets his body, but about, half an inch down is where I'm gonna start the curve, again, following that curve that I have on his belly, around, and then connect down before I get to the tail for his belly area, for his little tummy. Then I'm going to start adding in the bubbles for his spine going down the back. So start almost in the middle of his head, but go over to your left a little bit. And then just start adding kind of the half art moon bubble shape, following the curve of his back. And I'm gonna stop right where, almost where his fin meets, is at the line with his back. And I'm gonna create his little tail, just like I did with his nose, going arched. And then instead of coming around in front, I'm actually going to go inwards and come down. And then lastly, his cute little eye is going to be right about here. Okay, so there is my sketch of my seahorse. Next, I'm going to add in the sketch for my coral and my rocks over here on my lower left-hand side. So next, I'm going to add in my rocks and the coral that I have over here in the lower left-hand corner. So rocks, for me, they're just funky circles, so they don't have to be a perfect shape. But I do want to stack a few rocks on top of each other just so I have a bit more, oops. It looks a bit more natural instead of perfectly round and just one single rock by itself. I have a few here stacked one on top of the other. When drawing coral, I like to think, especially this one specifically that we're doing, I like to think of the shape that a cactus has whenever I'm drawing a desert scene. So I'm gonna start kind of in the center on the biggest rock, and then it's gonna spread outwards. So I'm gonna start by coming up and to the left. And then when I think of cactus, I think of branches coming out. They're kind of rounded, a rounded square at the top. They're not perfectly circular. And then I'm just going to keep adding in those branches. Going up. And then I'm going to bring this one down. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. So I don't have to worry about creating a perfect curve here. Having my hand, the natural shakiness of my hand, adding that different pattern to it is, I like it, it's good. Okay, so I have my first one, so I'm gonna add my second one going up the middle here. So again, just starting to come up, treating it much like a cactus, or how I would draw a cactus if I was drawing a desert scene. Okay, and then I'm actually going to combine the second and third one over here. I'm just gonna start to go up again. Back in. Okay, so there I have my rocks and my coral and my seahorse sketch. So next thing I'm going to do is start adding in layers to build on color. So I'm going to focus on the color of my seahorse first. I'm gonna come into my layers, click the plus sign to add a new layer. I'm gonna come into my sketch layer, click the N, and lower the opacity down to about 15%. So it's still there, it's just not as strong and I can color over it. In my color palette, I'm gonna go with a blue and orange theme today for the seahorse. So I'm gonna use this dark blue first. And I still have my brush set on dry ink. I am going to turn the brush size down to 8, just to make sure that it's not way too thick of a brush stroke whenever I'm drawing. So I'm just going to start by tracing the sketch that I have. I'm going to follow a lot of the same steps that I did whenever I was sketching it. Okay, so I'm going to drag that blue into my seahorse and drop to color fill the whole thing. And then I'm going to add a clipping mask for his belly. So in my layers, add a plus sign, click the plus sign to add a new layer, click the layer and select clipping mask. In my color palette, I'm going to select this dark orange. And then I'm actually going to turn off the blue layer, the seahorse layer that I just did, so that I can trace. Okay, make sure I'm still in that clipping mask. But that way it allows me to trace where I have the line for his belly, and now I can clearly see it. I'm gonna drag that in. Close that first. Now I'm going to drop that color in. Okay, so there's his belly. On a new layer, I'm going to add in the spines for the back of his neck and his back and his tail down here. So I'm gonna go back to that blue. I'm going to make sure this layer is behind my seahorse layer. I'm going to draw them in. Same with his tail. And make sure it's closed. So that I can drop in the color to fill. So for his fin, it is going to be the same blue that his body is, but we're going to add shadows behind it to make it stand out from the rest of his body. So in my layers, I'm going to click the plus sign. I'm going to make sure that it is on top of all of my layers. I'm going to come in and turn off the coloring of his body again. Make sure my brush is still on dry ink. I'm going to set it to 7. So when we come in and add details, we're going to see a shadow underneath his fin. So we'll see the difference between where his fin is located and the rest of his body. I am going to color this in just a little bit instead of closing it and doing a color fill. Because again, when doing those details, I'm actually going to smudge this up so it gets lighter as it goes into kind of where his body is. And again, that'll just help define one from the other. So come back in and turn that body layer back on. All right. Next, I'm going to add in his eye right here, and then we're gonna start working on adding shading and details into our seahorse. So I'm gonna come back to his body layer right here. Go to solid black. And about where the top of the spine is, I'm gonna come straight down. Draw a nice big oval for his eye. Change to pure white and add in that little bit of reflection. All right, so now we're going to go in and add more details and shading to our seahorse. So the first detail, the first shading that I'm going to add into my seahorse is going to be along his spine and kind of just around the outline of our little guy. So I'm going to focus my attention on this layer right here. I'm gonna add a new layer. Click the layer and select clipping mask. I'm then going to change the blending mode to multiply. So that way, when I'm using the same blue that is his body, on the outside, it's a much darker blue. It automatically darkens it for me. I am going to bump up my brush size to 40. And I am just going to go around the edges, the outside edges of his spine area and his little tail right here, as well as underneath, going down the bottom of his tail. Bump that up just a little bit more. So in my layers, I need to add a clipping mask here onto his body so I can add that same shadow going here underneath his tail. Let me change that to multiply. There we go. I'm also going to add a little bit here where his tail kind of curves over. I am going to add a shadow here where his jaw is, but I'm going to do that. I'm not going to use the blue. I'm actually going to change that to black to add more of a shadow. So now that I have this shadow here, I'm going to come back to my first clipping mask shadow, come into my adjustments and select blur. I'm going to blur that up. Let's add it to, let's take it to 12. Then I'm going to come into my second clipping mask and go through the same steps and bump that up to 12 as well. Okay, so next I'm going to add a second clipping mask on his spine. In between his spine and the first clipping mask that I did, I'm going to add a new layer, and it's already set as a clipping mask because this top one is as well. But I'm going to change the blend mode on this to screen. So I still have that same blue, but now it's going to lighten it for me. And again, I'm just following that curve. Okay, I'm going to come into my adjustments, select blur. I'm going to blur that one as well. Set that up to 12. So you can clearly see the division between where his head is and where his spine is. I'm going to come back in a little bit and actually add a little bit of a smudge here so you won't be able to tell that there's a hard edge there. It's going to soften it up just a bit. Okay. So before I do that, I'm going to add the So before I add that softer line around his body, I'm gonna come into the orange clipping mask here, and I'm gonna go through the same steps that I did on the outside to give it that difference of color. So again, I'm gonna add a clipping mask. I'm gonna come into my blend mode, set it to multiply. Go into my colors and select that orange, which is his belly. And then just on the outside of his belly, oops. I'm going to add just a bit of that darker orange. Come into my adjustments, go to blur. I'm going to set that one up to 10. Now I did come out of the orange a little bit right here, so I am going to go in with my eraser and clean that up. There we go. Gonna add another clipping mask. Set that to multiply again. And this time I'm gonna come in and add in, ooh, too large. Let's change that brush size down to 7. And I'm just gonna come in and add lines on his belly, just that detail. And since it's a clipping mask, I can start off of my seahorse and finish in his actual area where I'm coloring. Then I'm gonna change to screen on my next clipping mask. So it's the same orange, but now it's gonna do the opposite. It's going to lighten it up for me. So with all of these different clipping masks, because I have some of them set to different blend modes, I can't really merge them all together. I am going to merge the two that I have multiply on because those are the same blend mode. So it just takes, I'm not using as many layers now that I've merged those two together. Okay, the next piece I'm going to work on is going to be smoothing out this edge between the outline of his body and where his spine kind of connects to it. So in that body layer, I'm gonna select a new one, make sure it's a clipping mask, set this down to multiply, the blend mode to multiply, and change my color back to that blue. Want my brush size up again a little bit. And I am going to just create that shadow here on his, around the back of his body, the outline of his body. I'm gonna smudge a little bit. So I do have my smudge tool set to the dry ink, so it still has that texture that I was using with the pen. Okay. Then I'm going to do the same steps. However, this one I'm going to set to screen because that is the color that is on top of the bottom of his spine, so that way I can blend those two together. I'm gonna make this line a little bit smaller because I'm gonna use blur on this clipping mask instead of the smudge tool. I'm gonna stop it right where his tail and the spine are. I'm gonna come into my adjustments, select blur. Let's turn that to 5. I'm actually gonna smudge that just a little. Turn the size down. Let's go to 8. So that way I can kind of cover up where it changes. Come back into this layer and smudge that a bit more. Let's actually try putting a blur on that. Here we go. All right, so I set that blur up to 14. So now it's not as obvious that there's a cut line right there between where his body and the spine fin are in the back. Next detail I'm going to add is going to be the shadow underneath his jawline right here. So in my brushes, I'm going to change to the soft brush, which can be found in your airbrushing brush set. I'm going to change to black, and I'm going to turn my brush down to about 2%. I am actually going to turn off the color layer for his body, just so I can clearly see where that jaw is going to be for my shadow. So I'm going to add this onto the actual layer where his body is instead of doing a clipping mask. There we go. Okay, so now I can come in and clean it up. First, uh-oh. Set my eraser down too. So the next detail I'm going to add, the next shading, is going to be the shadow that shows where his jawline separates from the rest of his body. So again, add a clipping mask to my body layer. I'm gonna leave it at normal for my blend mode because I'm changing my pen color to black and my brush is going to move to that soft airbrush. I'm gonna turn it down to 1, and then I'm going to follow where I know his jawline is sitting. Okay, so again, the reason I did a clipping mask is because I'm not coloring on it here, but now I am. So I could easily start my arch off of his body and I don't have to worry about coming in and erasing it. So to soften that up, I'm gonna come into my adjustments, add a blur to it. Let's take it up to, let's go 5. And then come back with my eraser set to the soft airbrush, and I'm going to erase where it would be his jaw, because then we won't see that blur right there. I'm gonna clean it up. So I only want the blur to show where it would be underneath his jaw. So now I have a clean line where his jawline is. I don't have a blur where it shouldn't be. So we're almost done with our seahorse. We need to make sure we can see where his fin is. So we need to do something similar to what we did here with our jawline, that shadow, where our fin is here. So I'm actually going to add a clipping mask onto his body because that's where I want the shadow to show up, even though I am adding shadow underneath this layer. So new layer. I'm going to turn down the opacity of his body color so I can clearly see where I'm adding the shadow underneath his fin. My brush should still be set to soft brush and the pen color should be black. So just like I did with his jaw, I'm going to come in underneath his fin to add that shadow. So now I can turn the opacity all the way back up. come into my adjustments, add that blur to it. Okay. And then on his actual fin, I'm gonna come in with a different color, a lighter color blue, to finish coloring it in. And then I'm going to smudge my dark blue with my light blue together using that smudge tool. And there I have his little fin. The last detail that I'm going to add into our seahorse is going to be highlights, and then we can merge all of these layers together so that we can start building in on our coral and our rocks. So I'm going to make sure I still have it set to the soft brush. I'm going to change it to bright white. And it's set down to 1. I'm going to change the opacity down to about 50%. And I'm going to just lightly add in some highlights to our seahorse. Okay, so for me, I think my seahorse is good. I like how he's turned out. So in my layers, I am going to find all of my seahorse layers. I'm just going to pinch them all together to merge them all into one. So now I have a single layer of my seahorse. And I've now given myself the opportunity to add more layers to build my rocks and my coral. So now I'm going to focus on building up my rocks and drawing in my coral. So in my layers, I'm going to click the plus sign for a new layer. Still using the dry ink brush, I'm going to set it to this dark gray. I'm going to make my brush size, take it down to about 20, make sure the opacity is 100. And I'm going to draw each rock on its own layer. Put that one behind it. Okay, new layer. And then my last one. Okay, so now I can come in and drop or color fill in my rocks. So the reason I did them on different layers is so that when I come in to add shadows, it's easier to add them into the rock that I want the shadow on by adding a clipping mask, and then I don't have to worry about figuring out where this should be. It'll take care of it for me. Okay. So I'm going to draw my coral in next and then come back in and add all of the details to both the rocks and the coral. So the coral is behind all of my rocks. So I'm gonna click on the Seahorse layer and click the new layer. So it's adding it behind it. And then come into my color wheel and select this lighter orange. I'm gonna turn my brush size down to about 5. And then just start tracing around that coral. Again, I'm not worried about keeping my hand perfectly straight because I don't want necessarily perfectly straight lines on this coral. To me, it just makes it look a little bit more natural if it doesn't have perfectly curved or straight lines. It's a little bit more textural and it has more of that kind of natural bump to it. Okay. So I'm just going to draw a connector line. I'm going to see if I filled it. There we go. So now that I have my rocks and my coral, I'm gonna come in with all of the clipping masks and start adding in my highlights and my shadows. So in my layers, I'm going to work on this small rock over here on my left-hand side. So that is this layer 28 for me. Add a new layer, select that as a clipping mask. I'm going to change the blend mode on this to screen. Go back to that gray in my color palette, and then I'm going to change my brush to this wash brush that can be found in the water brush set in Procreate. And I'm going to turn the brush size up to about 20 and the opacity down to about 50. So that way I can just add, I can lighten that rock up a little bit, and I can add a little bit more depth to it just by adding some highlights. Okay, I'm gonna do the same on each of my rocks. So add that clipping mask, make sure it's set to screen. Add a new layer, clipping mask, screen. I'm trying that brush size back up for this larger rock. Okay, and then my last one, clipping mask, set it to screen. Okay. Next, I'm gonna add in they were kind of like dots. They were, to me, they would be divots on a rock. So they're darker than the actual rock itself. So I'm actually going to add a clipping mask again on each one of these and then set that to multiply. The brush I'm going to use is going to be this Driven Snow, which is found in the Elements brush library of your Procreate brushes. So Driven Snow, and then I have it turned up all the way, and I am on this rock over here, and I am just going to, which one am I on? I'm on the largest one. So I'm just going to kind of tap my brush to create that pattern and to add kind of like, again, the divots, the ruts in the rock. So again, I'm gonna go through that process on each one of my rocks. So the next one I'm going to work on is going to be this second one. So add a new layer, clipping mask. Okay. New layer, clipping mask. last rock. Okay. What I'm gonna do last is going to add a shadow in between where my rocks are overlapping to show that they are in fact overlapping. So for this rock, it's going to put a shadow on my second one here. So I'm going to add a clipping mask to this rock here. I'm gonna make sure my brush is set to black, and I'm gonna change it to noise. I'm gonna set that noise brush down to about 4, and then just wherever that rock will overlap, I'm gonna just trace the outline of that rock. Come into my adjustments and add a blur to it. I'm gonna take that up to 3. Let's take it up to 4. Okay, right here, this rock has 2 rocks overlapping. So I'm gonna find my largest one. Add that clipping mask. And do the same thing. Wherever those rocks are overlapping, I'm just gonna trace along the outside edge of it. Okay, and then come into my adjustments, add a blur. Let's take that blur up to about 6 on that one. Okay, so all of my details are done within my rocks. So just like I did with my seahorse, I'm going to start pinching my layers together to merge them together. So that way I have more layers to play with on my details for my coral and then my background. Okay, so now on my coral layer, I'm gonna click the plus sign to create a new layer, select clipping mask. I'm gonna set this one to multiply. I'm gonna come into my color palette and select the orange, which is this light orange right here. In my brushes, I'm gonna go back to that Driven Snow brush, and I'm just going to lightly add that detail onto this coral. So that way it gives it kind of that divot look as well into the coral. Okay, I'm gonna add one more detail. Clipping mask, set it to multiply. I'm gonna change my brush back to dry ink. I'm gonna bump that up to about, let's take it all the way up to 100, so that way I can draw on the outside. So I'm just going to add that dark shadow on the outsides of the coral. And then I'll add a blur to it. Okay, come into my adjustments, blur, and I'm gonna take that up to, let's do 10%. Okay, merge all of those layers together by pinching them together. And then I'm going to actually merge the rocks with the coral as well. Okay. So I'm gonna turn off my drawing guide. And the next thing I'm going to work on is my background. It is kind of a free-handed blob, so that's what we're going to. So now we're going to add our background. So in our layers, I'm going to add a layer in between my sketch and then where my seahorse is, because I want this background to be behind everything else. And then I'm going to select this really light color blue from the color palette. And then within my menu up top, I'm going to select my select tool, make sure it's set to freehand and color fill. And I am just going to draw just a funky shape around my seahorse and my coral and rocks, and then I'm going to tap it so now it's filled with that color. Okay, I do want to add some sand here to show the bottom of the ocean, so that way it doesn't look like I have rocks and coral randomly floating in the middle of the ocean over here. So on top of this layer, add a new layer, make it a clipping mask. We're gonna leave it on normal, and I'm going to change my color to this light orange, and I'm gonna change my brush to noise and set it all the way up at 100. Now, because it's a clipping mask, I can start outside of that shape and then color in, and you won't see where I was coloring outside of it. Okay. Now I want to add a darker color here on the bottom of the ocean floor. So I'm gonna add a new layer, make that a clipping mask, and set the blend mode to multiply. And around the outside, I'm just going to come in with same noise brush set to 100. And I'm just going to draw in that darker colored sand, come into my adjustments, and I am just going to add a very slight blur, 3%, so it blends in with this lighter color sand here. Okay. So now I do want to move my rocks and coral down a little bit and my seahorse up a bit. So in my layers, I'm going to work on my rocks and coral first. I'm going to select that layer and hit my arrow, so that way I can move them down. Okay. Select my seahorse, move him up and over. That looks better. So I can actually come in and turn off my sketch now. Couple of details I'm going to add into my background. I'm going to add a shadow here where the rocks are, even though they come outside of my shape. We're gonna add a blur to this so it will actually stretch it out a lot further. And then I'm gonna add just the slightest shadow for where my seahorse is sitting as well. So on top of this clipping mask layer, I'm gonna add a new layer. I'm gonna change my pen color to black. And I'm gonna come to this soft airbrush. I'm gonna set it at 3% and the opacity is at 50. And then I am just going to outline the bottom of where my rocks are. And then I'm also going to draw an oblong, an oval, color that in. Come up to my adjustments, select blur. Let me turn the opacity down on his shadow a bit more. Okay, now I'm going to come into my adjustments and select blur. Let's set that to 15%. So you can just still barely see it on the rocks and then just barely see his shadow there. So the last thing I'm going to do to my background is I'm going to add an outline to it so then I can extend it but also blur it so it doesn't have such a hard line for the outline of it. So in my layers between my sketch and my background, add a new layer. Set my brush to soft brush. I'm going to bump that up to about 12%. I am going to turn the opacity up to 100. And then wherever that blue, whoops, come into my color palette, go to that blue that I have for my water. Draw around the blue where it stops at the sand. I'm going to stop. Come into my color palette, select that tan right here for the sand, here. And then I'm just going to hold my finger down so that it picks up that I want to select this dark tan color. And then I'm going to finish the outline around. Come into my adjustments, select blur. I'm going to blur that, set that blur to 4. Then I'm going to come into my actual background layer and blur that as well. Set that to 4 too. Now here I have the tan coming up a little too high. So I'm going to come into my background layer with the smudge tool, just to kind of smudge that area right there so it's not as obvious that it's 2 different layers. Ooh. There we go. Okay. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to merge all of my background layers together. And there we have our cute little seahorse under the sea. So there we have it. Thank you so much for drawing with me today. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and click the bell so that you're notified when new videos are posted. Hope to see you soon.